Mexico is a country that has a very high homicide rate, and it also has a very large number of cactus. So is the large number of cactus the reason why homicide rates are high? Probably not, explains our invited expert today, Dr. Raul Zepeda Gil. Raul is a specialist in sociology of crime, and he talks with us about the so-called NINIs, a population that is ni en trabajo ni en educación, or not in work nor education. And in the UK, the concept includes training as well, which is basically inexistent in Mexico, so it's not included in the acronym. But it describes youth groups that are, to some degree, or at least statistically, idle. And these groups are stigmatized and associated statistically with crime. Are these people really the culprits behind the increasing number of both homicides over recent decades and other violent crime activities? Or maybe not. Maybe there are other factors behind that can explain better what and who drives this crime than just the fact that some people are idle. These and the policies that might be necessary to deal with this violence problem in Mexico, as well as the youth conflicts or lack of future for large groups of the population, especially in their young ages, is what we want to talk to today about in our new episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel, and we hope that you'll enjoy this episode as far as possible with such a somber topic. Raul, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Alice, for inviting me.
It's excellent to have you here. We want to talk with you today about a recent paper of yours that is about the so-called NINIs, the neither nors. We could maybe translate it to English. What are those neither nors, or who are those neither nors, and why do we have to care about them?
Well, again, thank you for the invitation. They have actually, I love that they have these acronyms for them. For the ones that are Spanish speaking, NINI means ni trabaja ni estudia, or not studying, not working. But the acronym came from the UK Department of Education 1997, that is called Not in Education, Employment or Training. And in English is the NEET population. And it's become a really famous word to call out the idle youth, the ones that we always think there are kids and young boys. Usually it's gender to boys, but I will explain something about the gender disparity in a second, that are doing nothing, and we assume that because they're doing nothing, because in some moment surveys, statistics, depending on how you capture the data about them, we assume that they're not working or not studying because some personal issues, or they have towards tendencies to commit crimes. That is my focus so far. Or that we think that there's something going on in the economy. And in Europe, this term was really popular from the 2000s because there was a lot of unemployment. So nobody was taking classes, nobody was training for jobs. And it's been a problem for many European economies. High on unemployment. Spain was one of them. Greece was one of them, having large bulge of young men doing nothing. But suddenly, this term was used and translated to Spanish as NINI, ni trabaja ni estudia, to try to explain why there's so many young boys joining drug cartels as hitmen or joining essentially crimes since 2006. So I became really interested in reading who are these boys, and even effectively the NEET population, the NEET youth, were the ones committing crimes, violent crimes, homicides, drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and other crimes that are related to organized crime in Mexico or not. This was a hot topic during the early stages of the drug war in 2007, 8, 9. because immediately one of the many important politicians in Mexico was the rector of the National University, Jose Narro. And usually this guy, the rector of the National University, is really famous in Mexico and has an authority as an public intellectual, said, yeah, they're the ones. They're the ones because there was a survey, the National Youth Survey, that found that there were about, if I'm not wrong, 50 million young boys in the NEET condition. So the debate began. And it's been a long-standing debate, and there are some papers that are trying, researchers from global, from several institutions that have said that they are, in fact, the main population that has been recruited by organized crime. And my argument is that that's not true. That they are not that there are some problems, theoretical ones, on trying to use this concept to try to understand organized crime in Mexico. But further, because there have been so many criticisms against the category NEET, that it's also blinding us from other factors that explain why some young men commit crimes or join organized crime organizations in Mexico. So that's why I'm interested in this concept. And there are criticisms from all sides. I can summarize them in two. In general, one is the theoretical one, that is, imagine you, Alisa, you are 15, you're doing nothing, you just drop out school, you are bored, and there's someone interviews you for a survey. You're one of the people that get for a survey in Mexico, for example, for youth surveys, or your parents are being interviewed about in a survey about your working conditions, and they ask, what is Alice doing? And they ask, is she working? No. Is she studying? No. Is she in training? No, nothing. So they will classify you like not necessarily as NEET, because there's not a square in the surveys for that, but someone could draw the data, say like she's one of them. The problem is that counting you as that doesn't mean that you are in fact stuck in that condition. They're assuming that you're stuck there, that you are doing nothing, and you will do nothing for a long time. But the problem is that you might, for example, you took a break. Like you didn't want to study that year, you're going to study next year. So you won't be NEET next year. That doesn't mean that every attribution that we made about your behavior or why you don't join the labor market, it's false, unless we ask you a second question of why you are in that condition. And usually that doesn't happen in many of these surveys. They're not asking you why, they're just counting you. The problem they count that is that they are not counting why you're in that. You can get some of that data in employment surveys that governments do. ENOE, that is the case of Mexico, they can ask you why you are not, if you are working actively, or if you are in one of the categories of employment that is called non-active, for example. And that happens to many girls in Mexico, and is that they are the ones staying at home because they assume domestic work and domestic employment, unpaid. So essentially they stay at home and they take care of the grandpa because he's sick, or they had a kid because they had an adolescent pregnancy. So they had a kid at 16, 17. So they find they're at home. They're being moms at home and not taking unemployment as second part of our work. So you have a problem of classification. Who are you and why you're classifying someone as a NiNi or someone as a NEET? So that's the first bunch of problems. How do you count? And then you have a second bunch of problems that is something that criminologists, people that study crime, define as labeling or discriminatory labeling. So essentially that by counting you as something, we assume that you are something. This is an old concept in sociology. For example, Erwin Goffman called it stigma. Essentially is that they discriminate against you in many institutions, or they decide to treat you in some way because they count you into a box that they assume that they behave in some way. It's clearly the case, for example, homosexuality. It was a case of the gypsies. It was a case for Black populations in the US, that they use this data or they used to use that data to make policy or even to shape social views of some people. So the label NINI became really contentious in Mexico because everyone said, like, if you're a NINI, they assume directly that you were an organized crime or you had a tendency to crime. But the problem is that not every NINI, one, does that. And the second is that assuming that of every young boy that is in this moment that they captured you during the survey as somewhat propense to crime, creates a labeling of discrimination against people that are essentially idle. And then there's been challenges to this concept, so I decided to challenge it again because, and I will close with my response to the first question, is because the government created a new program, social program, first employment program, based on this idea, that is Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, Youth Building Future. So if in your countries, wherever you are, you will find that there are some first employment programs for youth, because NEET population was a big problem. Since 2000, governments around the world did programs for them. So the Mexican government decided, and the president, the current president, he's going to be until next year, said, becarios no sicarios, people with scholarship, not hitmen. It's not the best translation, but it doesn't have the rhymes in Spanish.
He loves the slogans.
Yeah, he loves doing the slogans, a very catchy one. And it was essentially giving an allowance to a young boy to have his first employment in a company paid by the government for 1 year and see if they can take that as a working experience towards the first employment. That is fine. Like as a labor policy, first employment policy, work policy is fine. But also it assumed that if you did that, you will also deter recruitment by organized crime. And after 4 years, we have seen that homicide rates in Mexico has not decreased significantly. We usually measure homicides as rates that are per 100,000 inhabitants. So currently there are, if I'm not wrong, 27 per 100,000. That's a lot. So for giving you an example, during the Iraq War, you had homicide rates of 25. Current homicide rates of El Salvador are, well, now El Salvador 3 years ago were around 30, 32. That was the most dangerous country in the planet. In Colombia, during the height of the conflict, they reached to 50. So being the high 20s is a very highly contested and violent country. Countries that don't have much violence, for example, the UK is 2 per 100,000. So for each 100,000, there's 2 homicides. Like there's a huge difference. Some cities in the US, like Chicago, they have around 20. So really violent cities. And Mexico, as a country as a whole, is really violent. Guerrero, for example, one of our states, has a homicide rate of 50. And in some years there has been until 80. So by that standard, we're still a very violent country, and it's been stable in those high 20s, 25, 26, 27, for the last 5 years, 6 years, since the government of Enrique Peña Nieto. That is the previous government that we had. So if homicide rates are not decreasing, if this social policy has been deployed in all the country, what is happening? Why is it not working? If you are recruiting needs into jobs, why they are not being recruited by organized crime? So that's why inspecting in the paper, I'm trying to figure it out. So what I found is that focusing on needs as a concept is just gives a lever into nowhere. That is basically my argument. You're trying to shape policy from that concept, you're going to fail because you are not going to really identify who commits crimes in Mexico.
So the reason why you don't identify them is because it's not these people committing the crimes, or it's because they get recruited into organized crime anyways, or what's the solution? What's the answer behind?
It's because, again, taking the allegory of the snapshot, the problem is that we cannot certainly say that what they do is transition from idleness, so doing nothing, being idle, being NEET, being NiNi, to crime directly. Usually what happens during life, and sociologists and demographers know this really well, is that transitions from one phase to the other of life, for example, from school to work or from school to marriage, to having a kid, that these are the things that we call transitions to adulthood. These things that give us independence from our parents, and we become independent economically, socially, but also humans that do not necessarily rely on their parents for the living. So these transitions to adulthood usually are really messy. Like you might, for example, and that happens more in this day and age than it used to be the past century. For example, you could live with your parents for a long time, so you have no transition out of your house, but you might be married and have kids and have a work employment. So it's really difficult to say that someone that is idle essentially equates to we can quantify that they are doing this leap from, for example, very clean leaps from work to a school or to school from work. So the problem of that snapshot that the NEET data shows you is that it's not showing you the full picture of a life. So usually what social scientists do is using surveys that we call panel surveys for a long time, and we ask the same person, what is happening in your life? It's expensive to do them. Some countries do have them, some countries do not have them. That would be the best way to identify, for example, if someone is persistently without a job and persistently not in school, joins crime. So I would need to survey a lot of people in prison to know that. Due that we don't have that data, I use another database that is the National Inmate Survey. So Mexico has done 2 inmate surveys, so a sample of people in prisons to know basically and to predict how most of them are living, their working conditions, well, not the working conditions, their life conditions, how they're living into prison, how they were captured, all the things that we want to know from inmates. But they have some demographic questions. For example, what were you doing before you were captured? And that's the key question I used. So I ran the data, the raw data, and I saw like if they were unemployed and they didn't declare that they were in school, I could assume that they were at least before getting captured. That's the only standpoint. Like that's the only moment in life I could find. They were NEET, or if they were NEET or not they were NEET. They were NiNi or not NiNi. And I found that most of them had employment. So most of inmates declared before being captured for homicide, in this case, as my approximation to the ones that are in organized crime, most of them have an employment. And they declared what kind of employment they had. Some were working as sellers, some were working at offices. Most of them were farmers and working as informal sellers, vendors on the street. So that's what most of them declared in the survey. So if most of people were working before getting into prison for homicide, that is our most approximate data to know who actually committed crimes. So they weren't NiNi, like they weren't idle and they become imprisoned. But also there must be a hidden number there because nobody is going to declare I was working for a cartel. So nobody's going to tell you in the survey, yeah, I was working for a cartel and I was selling drugs for them. I was killing people on the street, or I was protecting the boss, or I was a hawk, so I was guiding the streets and see what was happening. But still, I assume that, for example, some might equate their activities within the cartel as activities in a job, a market. So that's one of the leaps I made, theoretical leaps. That is that assume that being an organized crime is work. So, for example, if you are what is the word? Someone that is outside a building and guards a building, so a guard, general, you can declare yourself as a guard. Who is your employer? It doesn't matter for a survey. Like you're not going to say, yeah, I was a guard for a drug cartel leader, but your job was guarding. If you're a drug seller, you can say you were a seller in a survey obviously you're not going to reveal that you were selling drugs, but you were a seller. Like, it's the same in the labor market. You're selling something that is illegal, and it's illegal in the market, but it's still a job. You're still working. You're receiving a wage. You're earning money out of it, and you're using your time to being productive in the economy. I did not find in the survey that they were unemployed. So that was my first, not in school. And the second is I double checked the data, homicide data. So essentially, we know the social demographic data of the homicide victims. Very, very basic one, not many details, but we know cause of death, age, gender. If we knew the working condition of these people, if they were affiliated to health services, because at the end, all this data is put into a death certificate. If you have the right to identification in your country and is working okay, a death certificate saying this person died because of this. That classification is based on the World Health Organization. There is the DNI-10. So from there, they will say that, for example, you died from homicide because of a weapon. So I draw the data from homicide victims for fire guns on the street as my approximation to who might be a victim of organized crime and also someone that could be potentially in organized crime. I run the data also if they were working or not. And most of them had employment too. So I just found 17% of them that we don't know if they were working, studying, or unemployed. But that's
17.
it. Sorry?
17. 1, 1 7.
17.
Mhm. Yeah.
So essentially, we don't know because you could not know, for example, if that person that you issued the death certificate was working or not. Like, and that happens a lot. You don't know if the person when you did the death certificate was working because you couldn't find the family. So the family is usually who tells the coroner what was the profession of the dead person. Oh, he was a vendor on the street. So that will be registered into the death certificate. That's why they wait for the family to identify a body, because they want to fill the death certificate. But these 17%, we cannot assume that they were unemployed. And even if we were assumed that they were unemployed and NiNi, is not a majority of homicide victims. So why I'm not finding the famous NiNis in the homicide data or in the inmate data? Essentially because they were working. So that's my full answer why NiNis are not the ones that we should be caring about. But also I understand particularly why would someone be saying that they could be NiNis. First, because there's a high concentration of NiNis, male NiNis or male NEET in some areas of Mexico where homicide rates are really high. So the previous studies that they tried to find what are the socioeconomic drivers behind violence in Mexico, they were essentially trying to say, yeah, we found that these regions have big clusters of NiNi population, and they tried to put it in young men, so we can assume that they are the ones being recruited. But when I disaggregated data from education and unemployment, we usually what we find out, and I think there's a consistency in all results, is that dropping out of school early, when you are having 9 years of schooling. So in the Mexican education system, 9 years of schooling is secondary school. So you jump to high school from the 9th year to the 10th year, you will drop out of school in that year. And that's consistent. Most of research has shown that leaving school early is highly correlated with homicides in Mexico. And I've also found that in the homicide data and in the inmate data, that most of them have less than 9 years of schooling. So they drop out early of school. So what I believe the NEET numbers were capturing were boys leaving school early and not necessarily unemployed ones. But the argument became heavily dependent on employment and not in education. And I think that's the key mistake that those previous studies did. But also, I don't criticize heavily the previous studies because we didn't have inmate data before. So the MPOL, that is the inmate surveys, data made in Mexico were done in 2016 and 2021. So I cannot say to the researchers that made a paper in 2010, 2011, you were wrong in the past, because I know that they had the available data they have. But I think that they should have checked the homicide certificates before doing the assumptions. And what they did is something that we technically call in criminology and social sciences as an ecological fallacy. I'm going to say super simply that you assume that something is happening in your environment, and because it happens a lot in correlation with something else, it must be it. For example, I'm going to give a really awful example, but someone told me this when I was studying statistics. Imagine that you have a lot of suicides in one region and you have a lot of cactuses. The numbers might go high, but that doesn't mean that growing more cactuses make people suicide. But if you put them into a statistical package on a database, they might look that they are correlated because they are in the same spot or geographical place. But that doesn't mean that one is related to the other. So what we saw before the 2016, when we had now that we have more data, is that we're basically in a problem. And the problem is that we were assuming that having a lot of NEET in one region essentially meant that that could be correlated to homicides. But I do believe that essentially it was a mistake of identification. But that's also a thing that most of research about Mexico did for many years, that they were assuming that because we had long homicide rates and we could have that data from homicides from some regions, we could use that data without knowing essentially the profiles of the one committing the crimes. Because we made a jump of faith by assuming that homicide victims were also members of organized crime. Because you're making an assumption. They're the same, so we are going to jump with them. But the problem is counting who you are counting. So what I argue is that we have to study from within the data of homicide inmates and also homicide victims, rather than aggregated data and put it in comparison with something that is happening in the region that those homicides happened. So most of homicides, they can tell you this homicide happened in this municipality or in this other municipality. And then you can make all these ecological assumptions, these environmental assumptions, that because they happen there and you have a high unemployment in that municipality, that might be correlated to homicides. But not necessarily you can make that assumption without knowing the profile of the people that are killed there. For example, one of the things that we have noticed is that also homicides of women in the households have been increasing. So how could I establish that they are also homicide victims from organized crime? I'm not certain that I could do that. But then when you see many of the papers before, they're using that data and saying, this is the homicide of each municipality. But you can disaggregate women and men, place and location where they died, methods how they were killed, age. So that's also why I've done my studies using an approximation that I think is fair, that is homicide rates with firearms on the street, like the most approximate number that we could have about violence in some regions. So I think that the NEET hypothesis that was running for many years was assuming too much, but also we have the advantage that we have better data today to affirm at least that maybe we shouldn't focus that much on unemployment, and we should focus even more on education, for example. That's one of the data that we have, one of the data points that we have so much coincidences. Also because it's a social goal that we can have, that is increasing the schooling rates in general, and not only for crime prevention. And if we want to use employment as a mechanism for crime prevention, maybe would be good to redesign those policies accordingly to the data that we have.
If you think about the schooling rates and education in general, it has increased quite a lot over the recent, I don't know, decades, 3, 4, 5 decades, right? So there are a lot more people with more education now than there used to be, but also homicide rates are very high now in comparison to 20 years ago, maybe. What's going on there?
What I think, and one of the arguments I'm doing also in my PhD thesis that I hope to publish really soon, is essentially that, and also I did an emphasis on education because we have a little more data that backups that hypothesis, that we shouldn't be focusing in only one factor behind recruitment, because we can find this. One of the things that I found on the inmate data that is on the paper too is that there's an increasing number of homicide inmates that have high school. So essentially they go, like this increase of schooling rates in Mexico in the last 20 years is also been reflected on people that also join organized crime and they have at least 1 year of high school. So they're not dropping out at secondary school, they're dropping in high school. What this data tells you, that you cannot explain everything by education. It's important, it's relevant, it has a high implication, a theoretical one, for example, is that education, schools form the decisions and social markets and also controls over the people, what they do, because that's what a school does, shapes your life choices, and it's made to make your life choices about your future employment. That's one of the functions of the school. But the problem is that if you rely too much on one variable, you will find the problem, that is that if that variable moves, as you have mentioned, then how do you explain that the other variable is not moving? My argument is that we have to make a more encompassing understanding of a subsegment of youth, that is the marginalized youth. So essentially that for some reasons or others, they don't have access to good labor markets that can give them dignified employment. Schooling is one of those. They might, for example, one of the things that we might see is that they even go to high school and they have two employments. That's something that can actually happen. Even if you register them as employed and have an education, that not necessarily means that they are out of the loop of vulnerability, socioeconomic vulnerability. So my argument is that we have to see all these ways of how they are marginalized, of labor markets are dignifying and giving salaries to them. And that's a problem that we are facing, that is multifactorial. So we have to hit on several places if we want to make policy.
What would the ideal policy package be? I mean, considering that, for example, the current government has augmented the minimum wages and it has provided these scholarship programs for youth, and so there's a couple of things going on. There's new universities for access for everybody. Is that the right direction, or what? Is there something that we're missing?
I think that there are several reasons. One is how these policies are designed. And the second is and how many people they cover. That's one of the main problems of these programs. For example, expanding higher education. Yeah, it's been expanding, but not that much. If I'm not wrong, the higher education rate now is around 37% of the population in the age of going to university attend university in Mexico. That's way below the ODID rate that usually it's around the 60s. So we have a bunch of people that are still not covered. The same with the youth employment program. It's a very small program now. Like it had like 1 million affiliated in the first year. Last time I checked, it has less than 300,000 affiliated youth into the program. So you have a problem of how many people are covered. If you have so many few people covered by these programs, obviously we won't have the spillover effects you're wanting to have. They have to be massive. And you cannot work with precarity and austerity to expand social services. But also I think that for example, Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, Youth Building Future in Mexico, has a problem that is designed for youth from high school. If I would make a change based on the data we have, is that we have to look closely to all the transitions to adulthood. For example, they are dropping out mostly from secondary school, enrolling into the program. right there. They can choose that they don't want the high school and they want to work immediately. That happens. That's a choice that they can make. So give an option for them. Mexico doesn't have very extensive training programs. If you have the NEET acronym, is neither an education, employment, or training. That's why it's very inadequate for Latin America. Latin America doesn't have big training programs that other countries, industrial economies have. For example, in the UK, you have a very apprenticeship program, very wide, because they're looking to, for example, you want to change from professions. If you don't go to university, you can have this like more kind of high school age degree that can give you some key skills. We don't have training programs. And maybe Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro could be apprenticeships, but also for people going out of secondary school to give them a joint training program with high school without unemployment at the same time. For example, bundle things, giving full packages of things. And the other is people that are transitioning, for example, with that might have two jobs. So the problem is that precarity is not only having an employment and having education. You might have an employment, but the problem with that employment is as precarious. Even if you consider that you have an employment, the problem is going to be salaries. So then you need to strengthen minimum wage policies, contractual obligations, reducing informality. So essentially it's fixing many of the problems of the labor market in Mexico. So it's fixing many things about job security, that you have a contract, that you know how much you're going to pay, and if they pay you, that is enough for living. Or if it's going to be part-time, it's going to live your study. You need a lot of policies that deal with the flexibility of the people that are, as them, very flexible at that age. So because they're looking for jobs, they're looking for opportunities, they're looking to shape their lives, they're making their first labor choices. So you have to make these labor choices more easily for them to join to the formal licit labor market and not the illicit labor market. So because that's the other argument that I do strongly. Organized crime is offering a labor market that is feasible for some, not the majority of young men, but for some because it has high salaries.
It's attractive. Yeah,
it's attractive.
In terms of salaries, of course.
But also prestige, because these can be prestigious jobs, but also a sense of meaning. Belonging, identity. Some of them might be already induced by their peers. So you need also another package of intervention that are not market-based. For example, most of the recruitment that I found so far for organized crime happens in schools. Like you have a peer that is already in organized crime and they tell you about it in the school, in the classroom. You can have a strong youth program of crime prevention in schools, like talking for them, because if they're going to drop out, the problem is if you attend them after dropping out, you're arriving too late. Transitions don't happen in one moment. Like you don't make a decision about the destiny of your life one day to the other. You might be, and you might be reckless on that sense. But most of people are weighing choices. They are taking decisions. They're thinking of the future. So like, maybe I do this, maybe I do that. So that's the moment that the state has to appear. There must be policies, for example, for these young men to feel that the school is worth it. But also, the problem is that has to be signaled with salaries. Many of these things is that they are not signaled with good salaries. They think that the jobs they're going to obtain in the legal market are really bad. So I think the minimum wage policy in Mexico lately is one of the good policies, but you must do a lot of things attached to that policy. That is not just increasing from the center the rate. You must do a lot of things that must do with labor protection, but also take them to schools and check their masculinities and their decisions. Many of these boys tend to feel more tendency to aggression and risk-taking. So you must do some intervention. It could be, for example, therapy. Many of these young boys that join organized crime have problems managing their anger. So you can work on that in several levels. Or they might feel bored in school. You have to find out why school is boring. Since many years, all the scholars that study why people leave school, one of the reasons is that it is boring. So you must do something with the curriculum. That is not what is being done now in Mexico, for the ones that are more close to the Mexican case. There's been a lot of curriculum reform, but usually curriculum reform in all countries is, then they say like we have to add more math, or we have to take out some math. Apparently that is a Mexican case. But they don't tell you we have to make school fun and interesting, and you have to do those things. And finally, I would emphasize the family structure. Many of the young boys that I found lived alone. They have no current contact with their parents. Their parents were working 15 hours a day instead of 9 to 5. They're working a lot, 2 jobs. Moms, for example, working moms, or moms that have 2 children and they have to take care of them. So you need parental oversight over boys. That's why parents are parents. They have to be guiding this voice. But how could you be a parent for your boy if you are not at the house, if you don't know what they're doing? That's why they must live in a household. So what is happening with families? There must be a whole package of based family policies that also has to do with the labor market. For example, that people work less hours in Mexico because we work a tons of hours. So during all these parts that you would like to be at home, that you would like them to be guiding these boys, are not at home. Parenting is hard labor. So being a parent is hard. But we need you to do that job. Society has given you as a parent, all the parents, obligation to take care of a kid. It's legal. Like, it's not only legal, it's the right to the kid to have a family that take care of them. That is not only giving money to them to eat. That's good enough, but not enough for them. For example, the boys that will go to organized crime, because many of these boys, you can read a book that is in Spanish in Mexico. It's called Morir es un alivio by Karina Garcia. Fantastic book, because you can see one streaming point that she makes in all the interviews, that is missing dads. They're not dads in those homes, giving masculine healthy roles to the kids, or abusing dads. And we have a problem in Mexico. It's like, what are doing these dads? Dads are hitting their boys, or dads are abandoning their boys and their families altogether, or they're absent. Like, they might be not cruel or abandoning, but they are absent because they're working. So we have to make a tons of policies that may be market oriented, but also on guidance of how you do parenting. So obviously, the NEET concept, what it creates, it's narrowing your vision so much that you don't see the rest of the things that happen in the life of a boy. So that's my general recommendation. We have to think of the life of a boy from the life of these boys' perspectives, and less from categories that are built statistically.
Raul, we're coming close to the end of our program, but I would like to ask you, what got you interested in this subject in the first place? Why are you researching this?
That is one of the most interesting questions. I am from a region that has a lot of violence, Mexico, Tierra Caliente. And I have a personal story attached to it. I'm son of university graduates. So essentially that makes me very fortunate. I was a nerdy kid that had tons of books, access to internet, and to cable TV and video games in a town that is really impoverished. But many of my friends in school, obviously they weren't. They didn't have the access to all of these things. Their parents were relatively poor, or they were have low salaries because they were farmers, workers, etc. So my childhood was interesting because I was a rich kid in my context. But after many years that I was studying there, I had a problem. And the problem that I had is that I went to university and didn't know about many of them. And I was really curious about what happened in their lives. And eventually became to study my region because it was very violent in Mexico. And then I went back to my town, and I knew that some of my school friends got into organized crime. So I know for experience because of their families' accounts. I cannot reveal names, etc. You have to be careful with those things. But I knew that many boys that went to school with me, they ended up in organized crime. So I was like, how my life was so different to theirs. Obviously, back in the day was just like a shocking fact. And I said, like, I have to research this. How my life is so different to theirs. And essentially, what I found is that I had the access to a labor market that they would never dreamed of. So, and my life was the different one. I was the outlier, and there were the ones living the real life that everyone has in my town where I grew up. So, and when I saw all the discussion about violence in Mexico, I felt that many of the explanations were not based on real life experiences. They were useful. They were downloading data and trying to run and understand what happens, and that's useful because we have some insights, and it's really important to understand reality to solve it. But I think that they were short-sighted on the sense of not understanding from their life perspective. So for me, it's really personal. And also because I felt that the explanations that many people were giving about organized crime in Mexico were heavily political. But also the other issue I found is like, I cannot explain these young boys' lives only by explaining drug cartels politics and militarization and democratization and all the kind of explanations are behind organized crime. Not that they aren't useful, no, there are, and they are the context. And it's the context that these boys are living with, but not necessarily the swings away of what is happening in party politics and criminal governance from a theoretical perspective responds to the question of why these boys got into organized crime. So it's like, yeah, this is my contribution. I want to highlight this topic. I want to highlight who commits these crimes rather than just assuming that they happen. And I'm not the first one. There are many researchers on organized crime due to Mexico, Elena Saola, Karina Garcia, and Cinema Chavez, and they have done fantastic contributions. Some of them are building my arguments upon their contributions. But also I feel that we need a new generation of studies that they just focus on interviewing them, interviewing people that are actually happening and living those things, because that could also inform, for example, statistical studies. Like, we can make better statistical questions if we understand more how they live, how they experience that, rather than expecting a theoretical or data-driven response, more like an anthropological response of how do we interpret that data, because that's also the important thing. These are lives' histories, and I want them to be known, not to take them guilt of what they have done, because they have done horrible things, and we know these horrible crimes. But if we want to stop it, and that's what I want, that is, I want to stop violence in my region and throughout Mexico, it's because we have to curtail the reserve army of labor of all these young men that are committing these crimes in the name of this organization and committing, some of them, atrocious human rights violations. So, and many of the researchers on conflict and violence do that. We understand who perpetrates violence to curtail it, to prevent it. Preventing it, it's useful, because the other solution that we have been seeing for the last 20 years is kill them. And that's essentially fighting the war. Well. Yeah, fighting the war against them and killing them is not been the solution so far. So we have to find alternative ones. And for me, it's crime prevention. A lot has to do with socioeconomic factors that are not essentially binded or leads to drug policy and drug violence, or not binded to militarization or politics, not that they're important. This is one aspect that has to be retaken into the discussion. And I said in this paper, we can take Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro as a very good launchpad to reform crime prevention policy. Can be done well. This is a good intended, well done, not well done policy, but has good intentions behind it. Let's transform those good intentions into good results.
Excellent wording and a good way to come to close after a very distressing and somewhat depressing topic overall. By the way, if you are interested in knowing more, we also have an episode with Sirenia Chavez that you mentioned, Raul, on the channel. So if you want to learn more about the situation, you can, and about her research, you can listen to that episode. Raul, thank you so much for enlightening us on this very specific problem for youth, and some of the solutions that we might have to envision to solve it, not only for that youth group that is stigmatized and in trouble already because of their condition of youth, and hopefully will be in a better position if we implement some of these policies. And for us who are parents of young boys, consider educating them and spending time with them adequately.
And the state has a role that is
Absolutely.
guiding everyone on what's
Absolutely.
best to guide parents.
Absolutely, parents and kids. I mean,
Yeah. Well,
care
kids.
program system.
Yeah, universe. Like, if we spend more money on taking care of kids,
We would have less
it's
problems
worth it.
afterwards. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, there you hear it. Thank you so much for joining us in this episode. I'm Liz Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel of Futures Frame TV, presented by Traces&Dreams. If you'd like to know more about inequalities, please join us again for another episode soon. And we hope that you have a very agreeable afternoon, and see you soon. Goodbye.